6 very young, very inexperienced, and very idealistic first-year students at Gordon Conwell Seminary, of which I was one, are preparing to go to Kenya, East Africa for 3 months. In preparation for that, we took the month of May to do some study and to hear some people in order to be prepared to go on the field. One of the people we made the mistake of inviting was Mrs. Elisabeth Elliot Leitch. I say a mistake because she didn't say what we wanted to hear. She mentioned 2 things specifically. The first thing she did after she sat down was to say, "I don't think the Africans need Christ any more than you do." That was a hard proposition to get rid of. The second thing she said was, "Don't think you can do anything unique that the African couldn't do." That just about shot down all of our reasons for going. I mean, we were very, very shocked at that, but it was true. And it wasn't very popular, but it was true. And her visit probably helped me more to prepare for that trip than anything else. In one of the books she's written, to which I turned about a week and a half ago when I was feeling kind of low and wondering when on earth I was going to be a mature Christian, if ever. And I thought, well, now I'll turn to the Liberty of Obedience, and I'll search that book and see what she has to say. Surely in there must be some inkling as to when I will be mature. And I quote, "No policy can encompass and advance the difficult paths through which God may lead a soul to maturity. The man who determines to go on to perfection must go on alone. The child must learn independence. James wrote that when endurance is fully developed, you will find you have become men of mature character with the right sort of independence. No 2 persons are subject to the same test. Each must endure the tests alone, and each must respond individually." Having sunk through that into the deepest depression of my life, I felt like saying, right to Mrs. Leitch and saying, "Dear Mrs. Leitch, thank you for that word of encouragement." But it was true, and I knew it. There's a scripture bore it out. Last night at Cary Presbyterian Church, she spoke about the great cloud of witnesses we have surrounding us in the form of the Old Testament saints and the New Testament saints, in the form of the saints that are now with us, in person and in book, and in how they had touched her life and oftentimes had ministered to her, and of the great cloud they become around us. She talked about the impact they had on her life. It's a rare privilege indeed to be able to stand before you and introduce one of the great cloud of saints that surround me, who has had an impact on my life in person and in her book, who was speaking on obedience, Mrs. Elisabeth Elliot Leitch.
That was such an interesting speech, Rich. I wish you'd just go on and on. And I can hardly wait to tell people back home that I went to a giant massage parlor in North Carolina. This thing is really in my way. I can't see my notes. Can you still hear me? Okay. It was suggested specifically this morning that I speak to you about obedience as a lifestyle. So I will do that. I would rather call it a life of obedience than a lifestyle, for the same reasons that I object to the idea that honesty is the best policy. If honesty is merely a policy, forget it. If obedience is merely a style which you adapt to, it's not good enough. This summer, I had a thrilling experience in a remote section of the mountains of Wales. Through a mutual friend, I had been invited to visit a sheep farm high in the mountains. Any of you who have been in the mountains of Wales know what beautiful country it is, really spectacular. And I took a train to a little town called Machantre and was met there by the sheep farmer and his wife and driven about a half an hour up into a deep ravine between high green hills to his farm. The man owns about 1,000 ewes and about 40 rams, a few cows, and some champion Scottish sheepdogs. I was most eager to see these dogs in operation. I had seen movies of sheepdogs herding sheep in Australia, and I had seen the actual fact of sheepdogs herding cows in Western Canada. And it was really a thrilling experience. And this time I was going to see the actual phenomenon of the sheepdog herding sheep. It happened to be the day when the rams had to be dipped. Sheep get maggots. I didn't know this. I guess any animal can get maggots if it has a lesion of some kind, but sheep get maggots just because they have wool. Blowflies lay their eggs in the sheep's wool. The eggs hatch and travel down through that tremendous thickness and feed on the living flesh of the sheep, and of course can eventually kill them. And so they have to be dipped in disinfectant, and this also is protection against ticks and several other diseases. And this has to be done periodically. And so the shepherd got on his horse and called his favorite dog, Mac, who was a black and white border collie from Scotland. And I watched them travel out onto the hills and out of sight. It wasn't long before I saw them come back across the pasture, the 40 rams racing in all directions, and the sheepdog marvelously circling the sheep continually, half circles to the right, half circles to the left, stopping, backing up, barking, waiting for a stray sheep. What I couldn't tell was that the sheepdog was receiving instructions at every moment from the shepherd, who was giving him a whistle. He had a little metal whistle that I couldn't hear because I was in the house upstairs where I could see across the pasture. And then later on, when the rams had been herded into a pen near the dip, the shepherd's wife and I went out to get a close-up view of how this operation would take place. And the shepherd took each of those rams, suddenly grabbed them by the horns, tipped them up backwards with great struggling, and of course the rams weighed 150 to 200 pounds apiece, so it took a very strong man to tip them upside down this way. The minute they found themselves back on their haunches, they relaxed. They knew that there was nothing else they could do. On some of them, he took a sharp knife and shaved their hoofs, because he explained to me that they get a hoof disease, which causes them to limp. And then, with no ceremony whatsoever, he plunged each ram into this bath, which was over their heads. The dog had made a great circle out around the pen, all the way around the bath, and back to the other side of an iron gate, and waited there, eyes blazing, crouching, for each ram as it was plunged into this bath. I said to Marie, the shepherd's wife, "What is the dog doing?" She says, "He really doesn't have any responsibility now, but he has sheep in his blood. And he spends 9/10 of his time at this gate, waiting for a sheep." Well, there was one job that the dog had to do sometimes, because the rams would instinctively, of course, start to swim. This bath was perhaps 10 feet long and about 6 or 7 feet deep, and they had to swim. And some of them struggled up toward the side to try to get out, and the dog immediately barked and snapped at them, sometimes actually biting them on the face, so that they had to go back into the water. Then they swam to the other end where there was a ramp that they could climb out. But just as they got their feet onto the ramp, the shepherd reached out with a great wooden implement that looked kind of like a hoe, hooked them by the horns, spun them around, brought them back, and dunked them all the way under the water, ears, horns, eyes, nose, and everything. And this was a Lysol-type bath. The ram, of course, came up spluttering, sneezing, shaking his head, raced for the other end of the ramp again, clambered out, and shook. And when a ram with I don't know how many pounds of wool shakes, you better get out of the way. And of course, it took a lot of spluttering and sneezing to get that ill-smelling medicine out of their eyes and noses. It seemed like very cruel treatment. And as I stood there and watched, there was no question in my mind that that shepherd loved every one of those sheep. And his object for those sheep was health and well-being. And the treatment that each one had to undergo was necessary. And I thought, if only we could explain to the sheep why he's not allowed to clamber out on the first try, why he is spun around, dunked under, and then finally allowed to escape. There was no explaining. And then I watched as the shepherd went to round up some of the ewes. And this time I was close enough so that I could hear the whistle. And the shepherd rode his horse far away from the herd of ewes, and he gave the dog his signals by this whistle. The dog traveled at top speed. When he heard the whistle to stop, he put on four-wheel brakes. I never saw anything like it. He stopped on a dime and invariably facing the sheep. It didn't matter what direction he was running. When he came to a halt, he faced the sheep in the same crouching, blazing-eyed position, not looking at the shepherd, but ears alert for the next whistle. And then he was given a whistle, circle to the right, half circle. Stop. Wait. Circle to the left. Stop. Wait. And I said to Mighty, the sheep don't know what's happening, do they? She said, they haven't a clue. And she said, the dog doesn't understand the pattern. Only obedience. That's where I'd like to begin. There is somebody in charge. And that dog knew who it was. As far as he could see, he was doing exactly what he was made to do when he was racing to keep those sheep in the herd. And he kept them in more or less of a circular form. But then suddenly the whistle came, stop. There was no reason to stop that the dog could see. But on went the brakes. Instant obedience. And that dog had been trained and trained and trained and trained and trained. He had come from generations and generations of dogs that had been trained and trained and trained. Discipline, discipline, discipline. And John the shepherd had just bought the champion sheepdog of Scotland. The year before, this dog had won the first place in the sheepdog trials. And he had 5 puppies from that dog, which he proudly showed to me. And he had great hopes for what those puppies would become, because they had in them the discipline of those generations. But then each puppy would have to go through that grueling training in which he learned to trust John the shepherd. As we talk about a life of obedience this morning, I want to talk about 3 things. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say. I'm going to try to say it. And then I'm going to tell you what I said. My husband, who had done a great deal more public speaking than I have, used to say, you make 4 speeches. There's the one you prepare. There's the one you actually deliver. There's the one your audience thinks it heard. and then there's the one that is reported in the newspapers. There's not necessarily any relationship between the four, but I'm going to have a go at it anyhow. First of all, who? Secondly, what? And thirdly, how? Now, there's a difficult outline that most of you will not be able to follow. Who is in charge? What is his purpose? How do I fulfill it? And I better find out how to fulfill the purpose of whoever's in charge here this morning. What time do you want me to stop? Some specific direction. All right, fine. I think I'll stop filming that. The dog knew who was in charge. The child who lives in a disciplined home knows, if he doesn't know anything else, who is in charge. And I thank my God with all my heart that I grew up in a home where somebody was in charge, and there was never any question as to who it was. If my father was at home, my father was in charge. If only my mother was at home, my mother was in charge. The kids never ran the show. Parents today are not really sure whether they're supposed to be in charge. Well, I have a friend who has raised children very wisely, and he said to me that his attitude was, this is our house, you're going to do things our way as long as you live here. And his kids understood that. Somebody says, what are you, some kind of an authoritarian? Yes, precisely, in case there was any doubt in your mind. I got this idea out of a book called the Bible. We just heard a very clear and concise explanation of the biblical basis for mission. When it comes right down to it, there is no reason whatsoever for any missionary ever to go out, except in obedience. All other motivations will prove inadequate, and certainly are not sufficient to survive the tests that the mission field will bludgeon you with. It's all very well to feel sorry for people who are less fortunate than you. Surely God can use that motive. There's no question in my mind that my first husband, Jim Elliot, had a strong streak of romance in him. The pioneer spirit, which Paul had, that he wanted to preach where nobody else had preached. He wanted to go to a tribe whose language had never been reduced to writing. He wanted to go to the most savage people he could find. A legitimate motive, and one which I really believe God uses, but not sufficient. Because the romance wears off. You get used to the sights. The pity is really a rather ephemeral emotion. And so it has to be obedience. And it's not just obedience to a set of feelings, ladies and gentlemen. It's a far cry from that. When the Apostle John found himself in exile on the island of Patmos, probably a very old man, undoubtedly a very lonely man, cut off from all that had ever been familiar to him, suffering all that exile means, which I doubt that anyone in this room knows anything about. He was given an overpowering vision of one like the Son of Man. He puts this down in black and white. I heard from behind me a voice loud as a trumpet call, saying, "Write down in a book what you see." I turned to see whose voice it was that was speaking to me, and when I had turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among these lampstands I saw someone like a son of man. He was dressed in a long robe with a golden girdle around his breast. His head and his hair were white as snow-white wool. His eyes blazed like fire, and his feet shone as the finest bronze glows in the furnace. His voice had the sound of a great waterfall. And I saw that in his right hand he held 7 stars. A sharp, 2-edged sword came out of his mouth, and his face was ablaze like the sun at its height. When my eyes took in this sight, I fell at his feet as dead. And he placed his right hand, remember the one that held the 7 stars, upon me, and said, and remember that this is a voice like a great waterfall, spoken from the mouth from which came a sharp 2-edged sword. And he said, "Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, the living one. I am he who was dead, and now you see me alive, the timeless ages. I hold in my hand the keys of death and the grave. Therefore, write down what you have seen." Could you obey somebody that looked like that? Could you disobey somebody that looked like that? Would you draw back and say, "What are you, some kind of an authoritarian?" He never demanded obedience, young people. He commanded it. Do you know the difference? The teacher who demands obedience of the child turns him off. The teacher who commands obedience leaves him no choice. It's God who commands us to go. And he's in charge. I know of no more fortifying, calming, strengthening, peace-giving doctrine in the whole of the Bible than his authority and his omnipotence. Do not be afraid. I am. It is the recognition of who he is that commands our obedience. And from the beginning of the Bible to the end, we find God revealing himself to individuals and saying, "I am." When Moses saw that fearful sight of a bush of fire in the desert and drew near and heard the voice, "Take your shoes off, the place you're standing is holy ground." He then listened, and the voice said, "I am." And when he was given his command as to what the job was going to be for him to do, in terror he said, "Who shall I say sent me?" And the voice said, "I am." Say, "I am sent me." And when Jacob was asleep on a pillow, a rock for a pillow in Bethel, and saw that vision of angels, the voice said, "I am." When a child is born, he becomes conscious immediately of another person. I will never, as long as I live, forget the miracle. When my child was born, at seeing her laid over here beside me 4 feet away, and her eyes were open and looked into my eyes. Why does a child look at your eyes? Why wasn't she looking at the ceiling or at my hands? miraculous recognition of a person. She had no way of knowing that this was her mother, but it didn't take long to find out. And the only reason that any child obeys the mother or the father is because he recognizes who this is. The reason that the dog obeyed the whistle was because he knew the master. And every time John went by the dog's kennels, they'd be leaping and straining at their leashes, or leaping at the bars, barking and howling. And he would go over and speak to them, and reach through and pat them. And they knew that he was their master. And the hand that held 7 stars was placed on the head of John. And he said, "Do not be afraid, I am." That's whom we obey. What is his purpose for us? There is no way to explain to those seemingly drowning rams that the purpose of the shepherd was their own happiness and well-being. There are times when we feel as if we've been hooked by the horns and dunked. And the only thing we can think about is getting that vile-smelling stuff out of our eyes and noses and breathing again. Is it possible that the shepherd whom we trusted has done this to us? The psalmist had this feeling when he said, "I am dumb because thou didst it." If it had been mine enemy, I could have understood it, but it was thou, mine own familiar friend. The difference between the ram and you and me is that we've been told, we've been given an intelligence and a revelation and a will. The sheep has no revelation. The sheep has no will. The sheep is an animal. But God created men to glorify him and to enjoy him forever. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, there is no way in the world that you can glorify God and enjoy him without being glorified yourself, without being so filled with joy that there's no way to express it. As C.S. Lewis has said, joy is the serious business of heaven. That's where we're headed. Purpose of that one like the Son of Man, so terrifying, dressed in a long robe with a golden girdle, his head and hair white as snow white wool, his eyes blazing like fire, his feet shining, his voice like a waterfall. His purpose is ultimately glory and joy. Get that through your heads. I can remember how scary the idea of the will of God seemed to me. And don't make any mistake about it, there are plenty of times when it still seems scary. And every time I'm brought up to another crisis and another test, I have to go back to lesson 1 in kindergarten of the School of Faith. Don't be afraid. I am. I'm in charge here. The hand that holds the 7 stars also holds the keys of hell and death. The keys to your life. The keys to joy. And my purpose is glory. We heard a few minutes ago about the Creator. The one who makes something knows what he's making it for. The one who makes a pot has a concept of a beautiful pot in his mind, and that vision takes form in that clay. And the clay, as Isaiah points out, can't say to the potter, "What are you up to? Why are you making me like this?" We're clay, but the difference between us and that earth is that we can say to the potter, "What are you up to? Why are you making me like this?" We're not likely to get any answers. It's none of our business, other than the ultimate purpose which he has told us. For my glory, for my joy, and for your glory and for your joy, because there's no way to fulfill the one without fulfilling the other. And so, if we can get it through our heads who it is that's in charge and what it is that he's up to, there's the basis of our faith. We trust him as a child trusts the father. If the dog, when he heard the whistle, evaluated the signal and thought, "Well, now let's weigh the possibilities here. We don't want to go overboard on this business of obedience. There's this to think about, and yes, but on the other hand, where would the sheep have been? Over the cliff." The whistle, the obedience, almost simultaneous. And that's trust. I remember my father telling me a story when I was a child about a little boy who had been taught instant obedience. And my parents used to say, delayed obedience is disobedience and deserved a spanking. It was no good to say, "I was just going to," or "I was just coming." Delayed obedience was disobedience. Came to exactly the same thing. By way of illustration, my father told me about a little boy who had been taught to obey instantly without any questions whatsoever. And he was playing on the railroad track. And you can guess the story. The father saw the train coming. The child was down on hands and knees playing with stones. There wouldn't have been time to say, "Get off the railroad track. There's a train coming." The father said, "Lie down." And the little boy lay down between the tracks. And the train went over him, leaving him unharmed. The child had asked, "Why, Daddy?" Would have been too late. The Maker knows why. The Maker alone has made the pattern. As Marty said to me, the dog doesn't understand the pattern, only obedience. God has graciously shown us a part of the pattern, by far the most important part, that ultimate end towards which we move. He doesn't explain the steps by which this pattern is worked out. When a man builds a boat, he knows exactly the proportion of the beam to the keel. He knows the height of the mast, how to straighten it, how to limb it, what size sails. And all of this is in accord with certain laws by which the boat will sail, because the object that he has in mind is sailing. And when you see the boat skimming along the horizon, silently, swiftly, a picture of freedom, you know that the only reason that that boat can move is in obedience to the laws of wind and wave. And the boat has been built for something. You and I were made for something. Isak Dinesen, one of the very greatest writers of the 20th century, far too little read. If you want some thrills, get her book, Out of Africa. She says there that pride is faith in the idea that God had when he made you. Now, pride to most Christians is a dirty word, but I'd like you to define it as Isak Dinesen defined it and think of it in another way. There's far too little of this kind of pride. Faith in the idea that God had when he made you. Is it possible that that lonely old exile, John, was proud that the hand that held the 7 stars had been laid on him? I think he was, and legitimately so. The God who made the galaxies is the God who has a plan for your life. Can you be proud of that? Isak Dinesen says, the proud man finds his happiness in the fulfillment of the idea of God, and he does not strive for a happiness which is not in accord with the idea of God. Modern liberation movements have taken you for a ride. They're attempting to persuade you to strive for an idea of happiness that has nothing whatsoever to do with the idea of God in the making of you. And Isak Dinesen goes on to say, some people will make you wonder if there ever was much of an idea, or if it has perhaps gotten lost along the way. Look around. Aren't there a lot of people who make you wonder if God ever had any idea at all in the making of them? Do you see the kind of pride that enables young people to stand up straight, to hold up their heads, to speak up, to smile, to admit that they were made by somebody and for something? For glory. Not to slouch, to slink, to chew gum, to wear blue jeans for every imaginable occasion. And I'm not knocking you for wearing blue jeans on a Saturday morning to an InterVarsity conference. But think about it. Think about your lifestyle. Have you been squeezed into the mold of the world around you because you didn't recognize something that most of the world doesn't recognize? Because it never occurred to you that you were made by somebody and for something? Ponder it. The sailboat fulfills perfectly the idea of the maker. And because it obeys the laws that that maker took into account in its construction, it works. Somebody has to sail the boat too, don't they? Can they do it any old way? Innovative? Unstructured? Doing their own thing? Any of you men or women who know how to sail know that there are rules. And you have jolly well got to obey the rules, or you'll find yourself in the drink. How much of your own thing can you do? Well, the sailboat does the will of the maker. And because it does the will of the maker, it is free. Free to sail. The bird fulfills the will of the maker. It was designed for flying. Did you know that birds have hollow bones? Their bones are stronger. The strongest kind of architectural structure for the amount of weight, I'm told, is a tube, a hollow tube. And birds' bones are tubes. Great strength and little weight. The bird has a keel to keep it balanced. The bird has to bear the weight of wings. But does the bird complain about having to bear the weight of wings? It's the weight of those wings that enable the bird to fly. And the bird fulfills perfectly the purpose of its designer. I don't need to belabor this point, I'm sure. I'm sure you've got it by now. Who is it that we obey? The one who's in charge. What is his purpose? Glory, joy, freedom. How do I fulfill it? By obedience. The way the dog fulfilled the master's purpose in herding up the sheep. The way the pot fulfills the potter's idea. The way the bird flies and the boat sails. And what does obedience mean? Jesus gave 3 very simple rules. If any man would be my disciple. Disciple comes from the same word as discipline. Discipline is obedience. A disciple is a learner. If any man, Jesus said, would be my disciple, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. In order to do this one thing, you have to deny yourself 100 other things. Every one of you, I assume, has chosen a college. I'm told that there are 2,000 colleges in this country to choose from, and by choosing one, you have denied yourself 1,999 other colleges. And you could have been paralyzed by the options. You want to weigh all the possibilities. Well, it would have taken a lifetime to weigh them, wouldn't it? You had to choose one, not knowing all the possibilities. That's what choice means. You know a few of them. You visited a few campuses. Your impressions were extremely superficial. You didn't like the physical plant. You didn't like the climate. You didn't like the looks of the first kid you saw or the first teacher you talked to. You didn't like the rules, the set of rules, or the cut system, or whatever. Not really very good reasons, any of them. You knew a few options, not very many, but you made one choice and thereby denied yourself the other 1,999 possibilities. You listen to Van Cliburn or Artur Rubinstein and you say, I'd give anything in the world if I could play the piano like that. And what you mean is anything but what it takes. Because in order to play the piano like that, Van Cliburn did not play football, soccer, tennis, make the Olympic swimming team, and tool around in a sports car all through high school. He was sitting at the piano when the other kids were doing those things. He was practicing hour after hour after hour, day in and day out, a week in and week out, month in and month out, because he wanted to do one thing passionately enough to deny himself all the other things. One of the first signs of maturity, Rich, is the ability to recognize limitations. Now, most of us are only too ready to recognize certain limitations and to deny the existence of others. And I can't sort them all out for you this morning. But if you decide to follow Christ, there will be a very high price exacted. And you will be limited to do certain things and not to do other things. What characterizes a baby? He has no recognition of limitation whatsoever. What he sees, he wants. What he doesn't get, he screams for. Daddy can do it, Mommy can get it. And it's only gradually that he comes to terms with the hard reality that Daddy can't always do it, Mommy can't and won't always get it, and it's not always available. And as he begins to come to terms with the limitations of his own acquisitions, he begins to think about other people. A man wrapped up in himself makes a very small package. And you have to begin to lay down your life. And when Jesus said, if any man would be my disciple, let him deny himself. This is the basic principle of Christianity. What is the central symbol of Christianity? The cross. And what does it mean? Sacrifice. There's no other religion in the world that has at its heart a sacrifice. And this is why Christianity is the only religion in the world that deals head-on with suffering and reality. When the will of man crosses the will of God, somebody has to die. Somebody did. And Paul said, I am crucified with Christ. And then here's where that incredible paradox comes in. Nevertheless, I live. Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. Can you hold your head up when you think about that? Can you speak up and speak out when you recognize that the Creator of all the worlds and all the universes and all the suns made you and loves you and puts his hand on you and says, don't be afraid, I am. Deny yourself all those other things in order to do this one thing, to lay down your life. When my husband Jim Elliot was only about 20, he wrote in his journal, have my blood, Lord, have it all. There's no way in the world that Jim could have imagined how literally that prayer would be fulfilled. I've already noticed a number of you carrying around the book called Shadow of the Almighty, and so you know how that prayer was fulfilled. Jim was killed on the point of an Alka spear in 1956, not very many years after he had written those words. And his blood, in a very literal sense, was poured out. Probably not many of you are likely to die that way. When you pray, have my blood, Lord, have it all, you don't really suppose that he's going to take you up on it physically. But he might. Every now and then I come to a crisis. I came to one last week where a hideous possibility raised its head. And my instant reaction was recoil, and I said, Lord, you wouldn't do this to me and to somebody I love, would you? And the answer was, I might. I just might. You said you trusted me. You trusted me there, and there, and there, and there, and there. All right, what about now? And I'm back to lesson 1. Don't be afraid. I am. I'm in charge. It comes right down to denying yourself and taking up a cross. That symbol of sacrifice. And don't suppose for a moment that that cross is something you cannot evade. If you're blind or crippled or a moron or a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or black or yellow or green or pink or whatever handicap you think you've got, if you even happen to be a woman, get it through your head that that is not your cross. Because the cross can be evaded. You can't change it if you're blind or crippled or white or black or female. The cross you may choose to disregard. The cross Jesus is talking about here is one that you have to will to accept. a cross that you can take up, not one that was laid on your shoulders as it was on Simon of Cyrene. And here's the difference between us and the animals. We've been given a free will in order that we might freely obey and freely love. And Jesus said, he that willeth to do his will shall know. That's the most scary thing to you, is how can I know what God wants me to do? The answer is right there. He that willeth to do his will shall know. And that is a promise. But I don't know what he wants me to do today. Hold it. There's something he wants you to do today that you know. Is it apologize to somebody? Write that letter? Make that phone call? Do that research? Finish that assignment? Sweep under your bed? Clean out the closet? What is the thing about which you think, I've just got to do that next week when I get organized? Is there one thing about which you said, I know I ought to? Oh, I know I should. I got to take off 5 pounds. That's the will of God for today, for this Saturday. The minute you do that thing because you know it's the thing God wants you to do today, you're in touch with God, and you have started on that road of discipleship. It's no good agonizing in prayer, sitting in seminars, reading books, taking notes, counseling, sharing endlessly about who am I going to marry, where am I going to go, what career am I going to choose, what's my major. What look to you like the major decisions of life, when on those tiny things you know in your heart that you're being disobedient. The only way you can prove that you're serious is to do that thing, that one little thing. And while you're doing it, saying, Lord, this is for you, for a change. Or quit doing something and saying, Lord, I quit this because you said quit it. That's the first step of taking up your cross. I don't know how to dive. I've always wished I could dive because I think nothing is more beautiful than to see a beautiful human body in midair, making a beautiful arc and cutting the water cleanly in perfect form. But the person who can do that had to start by diving. There's no other way to start. That's why I never learned, because everybody said you have to go in head first. I couldn't bring myself to go in head first. The only way to start obeying God is by obeying. You take the plunge. Jesus said, deny, take up, and follow. And the following, in the simplest terms, is to put one foot in front of another behind a guide. A guide is somebody who knows the way, somebody who's been over it. We have a guide. We don't have to go by ourselves. When I lived in the jungle, I learned one lesson very soon. Don't ever go out in the jungle alone. I did it once, and I got hopelessly lost. And from then on, I didn't want directions. I didn't want a map. I wanted somebody who'd been there. And that's what God has given us. He hasn't given us a blueprint of our lives. There's not a person here who knows the will of God for his life. Now, somebody's bound to go out of here and quote Elisabeth Elliot Leitch as having said, there's no way to find out what God wants you to do. I didn't say that. There's no way to know the will of God for your life. When I went to Ecuador, I believed that the will of God for my life was to be a missionary. When I married Jim Elliot, there was no question that the will of God for my life was to be his wife, and that lasted 2 years and 3 months. When I married Addison Leitch, I thought, well, this is it, at least for a while. By this time, I'd learned a few lessons, and that lasted just a little more than 4 years. I don't know where I'm going, except that I know I'm headed for glory and for joy. But I know the guide. I don't understand the pattern, but I know how to obey. I know that it's that little thing to do today. We have a map and a guide in the sense in the book that God has given us, the Bible. There's no other way that God is going to speak to you except in accord with that book. He never double-crosses himself. If you think you've got God's guidance and it's contrary to his word, you better think again. He doesn't lead you as an individual apart from the rest of the herd. He doesn't herd us as sheep in the sense of losing our individuality, but he guides the sheep in perfect harmony and in relation to each other. And if what you're going to do cuts across what the rest of the Christians who care about you believe, you better think again. And you've got prayer. There are 3 things to help you. Read your Bible, counsel with other Christians, pray. 4th, do the thing that you know you have to do. All right, now I'm going to tell you what I've said. Who is in charge? That's recognition. What is his purpose? That's trust. How do I fulfill it? And that's obedience. I want to read to you, in closing, a quotation from that marvelous 19th century Scottish writer, George MacDonald, through whose writing C.S. Lewis became a Christian. It may be my reader will desire me to say how the Lord will deliver him from his sins. That is like the lawyer's, who is my neighbor? The spirit of such a mode of receiving the Lord's offer of deliverance is the root of all the horrors of corrupt theology, so acceptable to those who love weak and beggarly horn books of religion. None of you were raised on horn books, nor was I. I had to look that up. A horn book was a tablet on which were written the alphabet and the multiplication tables and whatever other basic information a teacher wanted to give a child. And it was covered with horn, with a thin layer of horn, which was the only thing they had in those days before plastics and cellophane, which preserved this tablet. In other words, a sheet of directions, simple directions. It speaks of the horrors of corrupt theology, so acceptable to those who love weak and beggarly horn books of religion. Such questions spring from the passion for the fruit of the tree of knowledge, not the fruit of the tree of life. Men would understand. They do not care to obey. Understand, that is, where it is impossible, they should understand, save by obeying. For the sake of knowing, they postpone that which alone can enable them to know. They will not accept, that is, act upon their highest privilege, that of obeying the Son of God. It is on them that do his will that the day dawns. To them, the day star arises in their hearts. Obedience is the soul of knowledge. God forbid that I should seem to despise understanding. The New Testament is full of urgings to understand. Our whole life, to be life at all, must be a growth in understanding. Upon obedience, our energy must be spent. Understanding will follow.